Mr.
Okay.
Ashton? Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Fox. It's great to see everybody. I'm going to call this meeting of the Committee on Institutional Advancement to order. It's 5:05 on Tuesday, December 17th. It's great to be with everyone. We are convening here today to continue the dialogue we started in our November meeting around securing national preeminence. We're looking forward to having a healthy dialogue around that within the context of the questions that our committee has been asked to deliberate on, discuss, and explore. But in anticipation of that, in advance of that, I want to turn it over to our beloved president, Catherine Rowe, to refresh on our strategy mapping and her perspective on how we're going to proceed over the next year or so, and how some of this may play out from a strategic perspective. So, Madam President, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ashton. Do I have somebody driving slides for me?
Jessica's doing that.
Okay, that's great. Well, I'll recap briefly where we were at our last board meeting. We have kicked off a year's worth of work that runs through multiple committees, exploring from different perspectives in the committees how we think about national preeminence at William & Mary, what are the drivers for that, and above all, what makes that something that we value. It's clearly something that we do, and we want to think deeply about it in advance of moving in over the next 18 months into a new phase of strategic planning. And as I explained to the board, I imagine that strategic planning, here, new slide if you would, Jessica. Thanks. Let's move forward to the slides that lay out the key structure of a strategic plan, if you would. These are the background slides. We'll come back to them. And again, here we are. Thanks very much. As with Vision 2026, I imagine that our next plan, I intend that our next plan will build on a set of framing assumptions. It will anchor in our understanding of the value that we add for our students. Here you'll see language that frames this conversation in business terms. These are classic business ways to think about organizational planning. And so I'll be translating as we go between the business terms like customer value proposition and what we see we offer our students at William & Mary. We'll set vision and we'll set it in terms of some concrete goals. Next slide. But we begin that process by laying out opportunities, problems to solve, weaknesses in terms of the institution, and then mapping strategic actions against them in order to advance our position. Next slide. That process itself starts with something that I want to be doing with multiple groups, leadership groups this year, which is to look closely at our strengths and opportunities, strengths being internal factors, opportunities being external ones, and at our weaknesses and the threats coming our way. Again, internal and external factors. Next slide. As we build out Vision 2026, you can see we built it in terms of problems that we wanted to solve. Those are in red. Those are the challenges externally, weaknesses that we wanted to address, and actions that aligned our strengths with opportunities. Where we are now, under these 4 pillars, next slide, is here with a great deal of the key work accomplished or fully underway for Vision 2026. But it begins with a candid assessment of the strengths and weaknesses of the institution with respect to some goal. Here, the goal for Vision 2026 was to exit pandemic strong and to strengthen our financial and our educational position. Next slide. So this is what I hope our next strategy map will look like, with goals against the proposition right now that it is William & Mary's interest, it's in our advantage to secure national preeminence. That's the conversation that we started this past summer with the board. What are the opportunities for doing that? What are the challenges or threats coming our way in terms of problems that we can solve for? what are the weaknesses we want to address, and what are the strengths that we would match up against those problems to solve for and weaknesses. That will lead us over the coming 18 months to future actions and future outcomes. Next slide. All right, so before I go to the committee tasks now, Jessica, I'm going to ask you to back up to the positioning materials that we have looked at many times before as a board. These were circulated to campus some time ago, that shows the variable familiarity with William & Mary across the country of various constituents, prospective undergraduate students, in-state and out of state. And then if you go to the next slide, what in particular those students are looking for and where they see William & Mary as strong. This is a map that charts those strengths at William & Mary against what students, prospective students, are looking for, specifically undergraduate students. And it does that mapping from 2019 to 2023 when we repeated that positioning study. And what you'll see in that bottom right quadrant is areas where we have opportunities to meet important interests of our prospective students, the talent that we hope to recruit here. And the survey question to your right on the bottom right corner tells you what are the questions students were asked when they mapped our strengths against their interests. So I'll just give you a second to look at the bottom right quadrant. Moving any of those dots, gold and green, up, which is where we want them to be as a perceived strength of William & Mary among current students, and moving anything where we are strong or we're not strong to the right, advances us with this particular prospective audience nationally. Strong STEM, high job placement, high incomes, funded internships, fun, you see an active social life there, prep for the job market, affordability. All right. The big takeaway, of course, when you look at this whole chart here is the upper right quadrant, that academic rigor remains our strongest correlation between what our students are looking for, it's the number one thing they're looking for, and what we offer as an institution. All right, let's go back to the committee questions. Thanks, Jessica. So I want to just back up a little bit, if you would, one more slide, right where you were. That's it. I'd like to take just a few minutes, Mr. Ashton, to collect the thoughts of the committee members on what they think of when they think of national preeminence.
Everybody feel free to jump in at once.
I think there has to be brand recognition and high favorability. So in brand terms, it's awareness. It's a very consistent standard for awareness nationally. And then a high degree of favorability, a high degree for respect, and a sense of the value that a William & Mary education delivers, especially in the job market. So as a starting point, I would say that's not the total definition of national preeminence whatsoever, but I would say as a starting point. And that would be awareness and favorability with our most important audiences. And that includes our customers and our other really key stakeholders that deliver the education and make decisions having to do with the type of product we deliver, but equally the influencers who are influencers in higher ed, but more broadly than higher ed. Excuse me. And
Bless you.
thank you.
Others.
I see it as sort of putting us in the same conversation as other universities around the country that we see as, you know, leaders in higher education. You know, whether it's Ivy Leagues or top private schools or the few, a handful of top public schools as well, both with academics and athletics, I would say.
And Jen, this is with prospective students, this is with employers, this is with influencers, this is with faculty, the full range of stakeholders.
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
Jill, it's like John. Go for it, John.
So I guess if I read the mission statement and then ask myself to compare that to the slide 9, it does emphasize some of our perceived weaknesses or threats, right? It reemphasizes 1693, which is the old part. It talks about being grounded in liberal arts and sciences, but as I've only been at a couple of the meetings since I've joined the board, but I've heard this echo of we want to be viewed as more forward-thinking, more new, more, I guess the research does hit that, but it's the data and sciences, it's the STEM. So in that first sentence, you reemphasize two things that, at least from the chart here, kind of talk about that are perhaps things we're trying to change a little bit. And then it goes on and it hits more of the positive stuff. But anyway, I just note that it kind of jumped out. So.
I'd correlate the liberal arts and sciences with the interest in getting a job among prospective students. That land a job right away is a near-term payoff for an investment. And classically, higher ed has thought in terms of long-term return on investment, right? And when we see for our students, our graduates among four-year colleges in Virginia advance more quickly. William and Mary graduates in Virginia advance more quickly than their peers at any of the other four-year institutions. So they're being promoted, they're moving up in salary 5 and 10 years out faster than their peers. But they start out in part because we have education salaries, for example, teachers. They start out often at slightly lower salary points than engineers. We don't graduate engineers. So that push and pull, liberal arts and sciences, I think for many correlates to a longer return on investment, which was classically highly valued, particularly if you're going to go on to graduate school, which many of our graduates do, but is more challenging now for those who are looking to land a job right away that's really well paying rather than go on to graduate school, medical school, law school, right?
You know,
I do think that I was going to add that the commitment to internships speaks to that pretty directly, and the more visible it becomes that our undergraduates will have a fully funded internship, mentored, credit bearing, the stronger that near-term value proposition will be.
I'll jump back in with just a couple of other thoughts. And Laura Regas, who's on the call, she's not in a spot where she can talk, but she texted me just now just to sort of wanting to underscore the point about national awareness and favorability, that the awareness of William and Mary is so inconsistent and in parts of the country so low. that there is there's just a basic need to elevate brand awareness nationally, and that definitely is a foundational element to improve, becoming nationally preeminent. The other thing that I was going to make a slightly more esoteric point, and then like a very extremely practical point. I think national preeminence also means contributing to the matters in the public arena and in industry that are highly consequential. And so we have stakes in the ground now, thanks to the earlier version of the strategic plan around, obviously around data and water and careers and democracy. I think for William and Mary to be seen as doing work, as delivering thought leadership, intellectual capital, contributing to the public discourse and to the work of different industries in very tangible and valuable ways, I think is important. And I think that some of our schools either are already doing that and can amplify what they're doing, or they need to do more of it. And I think, for instance, the business school still has a lot of runway in front of it and has a lot of opportunity to dial up its thought leadership. The more practical point I wanted to make is, someone said this to me recently, and I genuinely can't remember who, but I thought it was a very astute observation. I think actually, I think now I remember, I was at a wedding in November of the daughter of friends of mine, and it was a big William and Mary reunion. And after the wedding was over, we were all like out for a drink. And I got a lot of incoming because I'm the William and Mary board member, right? So, and part of the incoming I got over drinks that night was that the university isn't making the most of its opportunity from a communication standpoint to profile and really share and make visible how successful its graduates are, which I know probably sounds like kind of shocking because I know that the team does a lot of that. But I think that our service orientation really comes through in our university communications, and I'm not sure because I haven't studied it carefully enough. So I'll just share it as a perception, and then we can figure out how true the perception is, how valid it is. But there's a perception that we could do a lot more to showcase and profile the people in the William and Mary family and alumni who are making a big difference in their industries, who have very successful careers in business, who, that we tend to profile people in the arts, or people in the social sciences, or people in other forms of service, or people in the public sector more than we do people in industry. And I don't know if that's true or not. I'm just sharing it as a perception. But I do think when I look at that data and I see that students want to know that they're going to get an education here that leads to a career and leads to a high-paying job and leads to success and leads to economic security, which is really what they're saying, that there's probably more we can do apart from, changing anything that's fundamental. I just think that we do have a good story there, and we should do more with it.
That's a great one. And I would carry your sequence from the high-paying job and career, land the job, right? Land the job first, because then you can pursue what you care about. For many, that is about self-determination in a very fundamental way that matters a lot. Should we move on to the set of questions,
Well,
slightly more focused, or anything to add here?
let me, if I may, Madam President, I think Jill wants to get something in as well.
Okay.
I certainly agree with all that's been shared thus far, and I think I said this in one of the committee meetings in November. The idea for me is broad amongst all the stakeholders that are really important, broad, unaided awareness and acceptance of our absolute and relative comprehensive excellence as a university. That's how I would sum up this notion of being nationally preeminent. And I think that's, that's aligned with everything that's been shared. I think, though, in terms of brass tacks, there are very few, and Madam President, you may have said this, at least in some of our, smaller group settings. But in terms of brass tacks, what we're talking about is universities with lots of resources. Like when you cut all through it, that's what we're talking about. And, so one of the questions we have to be really tussling with is, what are the efficient, unique ways that we can unlock resource creation institutionally so that we can accelerate what we're up to? There are almost no universities that are under-resourced that have national preeminence. If somebody can name one besides us, I'd be interested in hearing it. And so we have to be thinking about, how do we do a research triangle? How do we create a Silicon Valley? How do we do things that are really innovative and path-breaking so that we're not slogging this out until our grandchildren have grandchildren? We can sort of leapfrog a little bit. So I wanted to share that before we got into the question. But Jill, I thought you wanted to get in as well.
I don't want to be redundant. I think everything intelligent has been said, and I agree with all of it. I do think that it's really simple, and it's two key pieces. One is name ID. We've talked about that, brand recognition, just name saturation. We are such a famous school for so many reasons that we should be in every geography recognized and well known. And I know you guys are working on that, and you're doing a good job with trying to be intentional about looking at geography and where we're putting ourselves. That's key, because once that happens and we become ubiquitous among people who are talking about what's a competitive, phenomenal institution that stands out. We want to stand out because people know us. But then, and this is something we've talked about in sort of around the edges, but we are who we are, and we have been that for, several hundred years. And it's hard to break and do something that creates a standout opportunity or a standout moment for the institution. But schools that are really competitive and that drive numbers and interest and name ID are schools that do something different. And I know we're making changes and we're pushing towards, communicating about William & Mary in a way that is very appealing to young people. I mean, you think about all the things that we have going, but I also think there's an opportunity to layer in something that, like some of the handful of other schools that are super competitive, there is something unique about them that stands out that everybody says, I know about that school because they do X. And for some, it may be, they're launching the great AI incubator. For others, it might be, hey, they're doing this. For others, it might be something about how you about the curriculum. But I would love for William & Mary, and there's so many intelligent, innovative people who have incredible ideas about higher education. And so many of them are actually associated with William & Mary. And I would love for us to be a place where something really dramatic happens that draws attention to the university and is also a meaningful and impactful, that we become a meaningful and impactful change agent around higher ed in a way that actually attracts the best students. And that gets folded in then into sort of the fact that we work on becoming ubiquitous, but they go hand in hand. And you want to stand out for something. And when I think about young people who are talking about the choices they're making, they make a choice because a school appeals to them for something. And right now, William & Mary is known for and appealing for being very academic. And that's great. We want to lean into that. But we are so much more. And we do have, all kinds of tremendous opportunity for innovation just because of our geography. So anyway, I hate to belabor that because other people have said it more eloquently than I, but I do think the one added piece is something that is different that we know we can do and that we've talked about around the edges, but could really make us stand out.
Thank you for that, Jill. Before we go to the additional questions, it'd be interesting to hear if folks have a sense or experience that they'd like to share where they see us being discussed nationally. Any examples of that, particularly where we can lean in more, would be, I think, maybe fruitful to discuss a bit.
I feel like nationally it's such a big topic because the nation is so big and so diverse, right? And the truth is, I don't think we are a national brand. I think we might have been at one time, but I feel like we are like a specialty brand nationally, almost like in the category if you know, like, and I mean like taking it out of Virginia, taking it out of DC or the East Coast and taking it deeper out, further out west or I think, and I think that's the concern that we've had collectively is that as the world has progressed and as education has become more competitive and as the education landscape has changed so much since many of us were in school, it was a simpler time when I was at William and Mary and when I was in the job market as a recent grad, I mean, I felt like we had fabulous brand recognition in the New York area, in Manhattan, in New York. People knew us, people respected us, people associated us with greatness. And there was an awareness that it's a very high hurdle to get into William and Mary from out of state, especially from the New York metropolitan area. So there was almost like an elite quality to the brand. And in all my travels, and I travel a lot, like I have to work harder to close that gap. I have to explain what William and Mary is. If I'm overseas, certainly, but even if I'm in, different parts of the country. So that's very anecdotal. But I think that's an experience that others are having as well. And so, I was just yesterday, I think it was just yesterday, I was moderating a corporate governance conference in New York. And some of you may know the National Association of Corporate Directors, the NACD. They're based in Northern Virginia. There were a lot of people there from Northern Virginia. And in our breakouts, like we were talking about higher ed. And when people heard I was on the board of William and Mary, it was very similar. It was like general awareness. Someone's child, eldest child had been to school there. He loved it, wanted to talk to me privately about how wonderful William and Mary is, was like incredibly enthused. And then there were others who were like really unclear. And then others really wanted me to drill down on the differences between the different Virginia universities and why someone chooses UVA versus William and Mary. And then there was a tangent on Virginia Tech. I mean, this was just yesterday in Manhattan with a national group of public company directors. And, it was all over the place. So I realize that I'm not answering your question, Kendrick, sorry, but it's a good question because I've been a little stumped to tell you when I can think of a time when when I felt that there was national recognition or that we were being discussed, as being nationally preeminent. I'm sure others have more positive.
Yeah, I would
comments.
just, but by way of example, the two that immediately come to mind for me are the Bracewell, which has been everywhere for the last year and a half or so. It's a really, really extraordinary example of what William & Mary is capable of, and the history that is resident in Williamsburg. So I could say more about the Brave School and the work the university's done around that in partnership with Colonial Williamsburg, but it really is, there's not a single major news outlet that has not reported on the Brave School. So that's one example. The second is obviously the $100 million gift for the Batten School and our leadership around water, which I want to continue to reiterate is the direct outgrowth of the strategy that we aligned around. So another massive achievement by the university, which also got global. When I say global, I'm not exaggerating, global recognition. There are a couple examples. We obviously are very prominent in almost all of the publications around higher ed. You may think of that as being a bit more niche, but students are certainly reading those things. And we may not feel good about all our rankings, but we should feel, I think, good about a lot of them. And we're prominently featured regularly in all of the rankings. So I won't hog the floor here because there are more examples, but I just wanted to spur the conversation a bit by sharing a couple of examples of where we're being discussed nationally and where our strengths are really laid bare for people to observe.
So I'll add my voice on just one thing. I think that I live in the DC area, so William & Mary has a very strong reputation here in Northern Virginia, particularly in the Fairfax County, Loudoun County public school systems. And moms and dads really want their children to get into William & Mary and to go. And so I think that the view here is you got to be really smart to get in, and you need to be very vigilant to stay in. And what I mean stay in, to get through it, because it's tough. It is where there are some perhaps other schools that they may be very difficult to get in, but once you kind of get there, it's a little bit of an easier ride. And so I do think that is part of its reputation, that it is a tough place, just because it's really challenging academically. But when you get through that, you are really prepared. And I think when I'm looking at in front on the mission statement, it talks about that, to meet the most pressing needs of our time, you're prepared for that. But it is something that takes time. And, the challenge in some of what we see today in many colleges, particularly in the sports, is that they want things now. Everything has to be now. And some things, particularly an education, a great education that will serve you over your life, just takes time. And so you do see that kind of push and pull. When you read this mission statement, it does talk about the place. I just looked at some of the others from other schools, and some of those tend to talk more about the student. It's almost like, what are you going to get now, as opposed to this great institution that is a process. And so, but again, I live up here in the DC area, and the reputation is very strong. And I know that some of the early announcements went out last week, and they got some very happy kids up here. So
I was told by my son, who's got friends who went to high school in Northern Virginia, that William & Mary is where the nice kids go. Just saying.
that's right.
Also, we're
Right.
very well known among ultimate players nationwide.
Right.
Just can't let it go without that.
Yes,
Can't let it go.
respect. Yes, definitely. Yeah.
Awesome. Shall we move to
Yes, please.
our committee questions? Okay. Well, you guys can read, but I think working through these at some level, maybe over the next 20 minutes or so, I think would be a productive use of time. So, why don't we start with the first one? And Anna Maria, don't be shy. You've had the floor a good bit here, but you're really good on this particular point, and so it would be great if you could sort of lead a perspective on reputational assessment, and others can chime in.
Okay. I happy to, and I will be succinct. So, the positioning research that's been done so far is very helpful, and it does give us a direction of travel between 2019 and 2023, and it's not there's some truth in that we have to deal with. In other words, the direction of travel is not, in some important ways, is not positive. I think we can build on that. Like I feel like we need to define a peer group, and there are certain organizations for whom it's very difficult to define a peer group, and I think we're one of them for many of the reasons all of you know, that we are in many respects neither fish nor fowl. And I think that is we're wonderful, we're exceptional, we're incredibly special, but we're hard to categorize in certain respects. So I really think we have to endeavor to come to terms with who our proxy peers are and what are the criteria we're going to use for identifying that peer set. And I know that the advancement team, I mean, Matthew has certainly shown us in the past as we've prepared for campaigns or looked at alumni engagement, or there's a big group of peers that we've studied, and I think we need to maybe hone that and figure out, like, for the next plan period, who are the peers that we want to study, and will be relevant, and then we have to figure out what the performance indicators are for reputation for William & Mary, and some of those will be typical higher education performance indicators, and some of them will be more bespoke or custom to us, and that is how good reputation research is done. Is that there are certain categories of indicators, depending on the type of organization you are, that matter. But then within your peer set and within the history of the organization, there'll be some that are more important. So you end up with your own bespoke set of indicators, and then you start to measure, you start to assess based on the stakeholders that are the most material, excuse me, to your success. So there is an additional piece of research that we can undertake going forward, and I would presume that the advancement and the marketing team, have that as part of their plan, that research will continue. I do think that we're at a phase where we have to reset on our global brand strategy, and we have to develop a really robust global brand strategy, and the insights really have to inform that strategy. And we have a bunch of insights. We have some really good insights to draw on directly. But we would, design the reputation research so that it could inform the brand strategy and help us evaluate it and progress it. So I know Heather and the team are looking at this and are having related conversations, so they will have more to add. But there is, this takes effort and commitment, but it's also eminently doable, and it will be, if it's designed well and done well, it will be very valuable.
This is really helpful for me to hear that
great,
kind
Anna-Maria.
of map. Yeah. May I ask a question about the construction of a peer set? Does it matter? Does it have to be the same institutions for each of those indicators? Because it would be much easier if we could say, for example, we're going to think of an academic peer set, or we're going to think of a financial peer set that's something like expenditure per student, size of the endowment, size of the institution. Those, you said we are neither fish nor fowl, and those are sort of the the bird and fish categories that don't match up with each other for William and Mary, but there's others that where it would a third one would be if somebody applies to William and Mary and goes somewhere else, where do they go? Right, in state or out of state. So those categories don't align with each other.
They don't, and this is, in the corporate realm,
Is
this
that
is
normal?
Yeah, it's not that unusual. Occasionally you will
Okay.
get a company that is, well, not just occasionally. I mean, especially big technology companies or big industrial companies or even big healthcare companies, a lot of conglomerates are breaking up because that's the trend for value creation, because nobody has an attention span anymore to deal with the complexity of a conglomerate. But apart from that, this is part of the problem but some of those companies that are bigger and more complex, they struggle like in this way to develop their peer set because they have to think about their end markets. It's like, okay, we are active in these major industries, so we have to pick some peers who are also active in these industries. And then they may say, but we're an extremely science and R&D driven organization, so we want to compare ourselves to others who have a big R&D expenditure or investment and a similar cycle of returns, or they may say, we are active in the Americas, but we're not truly international, and so we want to look at other peers that are really big in the US and Canada. You know what I mean? So they will
Right.
they will figure out the criteria that are the set of criteria that are the most relevant, realizing that they will choose peers according to those criteria, and it may look like a hodgepodge of peers.
Yes, that's okay. That's great. We've tried to do every time we've had this conversation before, in my experience, we've tried to figure out what's a stable set regardless of the measure that we're thinking about, and that leads to chaos.
Yeah. And then sometimes they'll look at it like strictly through the investor lens. It's like, okay, well, our investors, when they look at us and measure us, they're always comparing us to X other company, and we compete in certain ways and we have certain things in common, so we should include them in our proxy peer set, because if we don't, like, they're basically we're going to be evaluated against them anyway, so there might be some other institutions that maybe don't meet some of those other criteria, but who, by default are seen as our peer. And so that might be like another consideration, but that would be like, we would have some criteria and we would make a determination on a reasonable group of peers. And it's okay also if we stretch a little bit and make some that are slightly more aspirational. Yeah.
It's instructive just for, I'll shut up in a second, but for those on the call to go to SHEV and look at the approved peer group for William and Mary and SHEV, which is a mix of public and private. And it's all over the place from the standpoint, to Mr. Ashen's point about resources. It is national. It is national.
Yeah.
Thank you, Anna Maria. Jill, Jen, John, any thoughts on this reputational assessment question? No?
I don't
Okay.
have anything.
Okay. No, Anna Maria was very thorough, which is what I expected. This is the bullseye for her expertise. So thank you for that, Anna Maria. How about number 2? Influencing perception inside and outside the university. Jen, any thoughts on influencing perception? Things like
Yeah,
you're off mute.
yeah,
Yeah.
sure. Yeah, I'm struggling a little bit trying to just think through, to me, I do think, I think Jill maybe mentioned this, but I do think this, you know, whether it's the national preeminence or the reputation, I think our strength is the type of graduate we produce. And leaning into that is incredibly important. But at the same time, in some ways, the way to do that is to highlight areas in which we are a leader. And you mentioned a couple of them, Kendrick, and those are specific, and those aren't necessarily tied to what we're really good at in terms of creating these incredible graduates. But if that's the method by which we're able to get the recognition and the and change the perception, I think that makes sense. The only other thing I was going to mention is looking at certain metrics as a way to lump up, to create the peer group that we want. So to say that we belong in this peer group because these are the outcomes, or these are what are the students coming in, or what they're doing, or what they're doing when they graduate, and also differentiating us maybe from the schools that we don't want to be our peers, that for whatever reason maybe we are perceived as, by saying, we're doing X, Y, and Z, and they're not. I don't know if that I'm necessarily answering this exact question, but that's just a few of my thoughts that I've been thinking about during the conversation.
That's great. And
So,
John?
Madam President, there was a slide that we saw in our last meeting, and I've forgotten, there were lots of slides, but there was one in particular that talked about students recommending William and Mary to others, current students who were recommending William and Mary to others, and that number had dropped fairly. It seemed to be material drop. And that kind of goes to this first question about influencing perceptions inside the school. Is that something that was that just a blip, or is that something that is just generally with perhaps this generation of all schools, that none of them are kind of happy where they are? Or what was your sense, if you have a recollection of that slide, and what your sense of that, because that might tell us a little bit about influencing those perceptions inside the school.
What about a question to me?
Yes, Madam President.
I can,
Yes.
okay, go ahead.
Or Matthew, go ahead, jump in.
Sure, yeah, Mr. Brownlee, you're right. I don't have the stat in front of me, but I'm hoping Heather or Brian will find that momentarily here. But we saw, as did all schools, a significant drop during pandemic and just after pandemic, and there were a whole lot of reasons why. And the firms that we've worked with, that worked with a lot of other national universities, saw the same kinds of drops between pre-pandemic 2019, when we had our last positioning study, and post-pandemic 2023, when we had the later one. Let me see if either Heather or Brian have the exact number.
So I don't have it off the top of my head as I'm driving, but there was a 20-point difference between the 2019 NPS score and the 2023. And so to Matthew, what Matthew just said is what we're also hearing, is that not uncommon from those who conducted the surveys during that time to see that kind of drop post-pandemic. We have not done a study in 2024. We are slated to do it next year. Those who have done an NPS score study in 2024 are starting to see an upswing now among current student sentiment. So I think it's something for us to be mindful of, about, what is the student experience that we're offering, and understanding that it does influence perception, because how they talk about the school to others is important. But I do think we're hopeful that we're going to see that we're following a progression that's not dissimilar from other schools, that there is a post-pandemic dip that hopefully is starting to come back up again. But more research is needed to verify that.
Let me add, there was a very material, I think when the survey was in the field, a very material issue that we had to address, which was subpar dining. And it was at the front of students' minds. It was something that we had to do a heavy lift on to make a change. And from what we can tell, tracking closely now, there's significant improvement in that service. I know coming out of pandemic that the quality of the living experience is more important to students than it was before pandemic, no question.
Yeah.
There's a sense of we want to be in college together. We want to be having a really generative social life. That is part of being in a learning community that we're expecting. So I'm hoping, John, that also, that we see the results of having worked really hard on improving dining.
Yeah. And of course, all the work that's being done on the dormitories and things like that is really
Yeah.
addressing that person. I mean, you can't walk around the school and see all the cranes and building. And so all of that seems to me is going to influence that question in a real positive way. So,
I think so. Look, 40% of our dorms were unair conditioned when we started. And I know it's a point of pride with many alumni. I love the jokes and the earned, like the sweat that they earned. I also know that it is straight up hotter than it was, and too hot to be able really to sleep. That's not going to work.
right. Great.
Yeah,
Thank you.
totally. You know, I will give us a bit of a provocation that I do think I think that there is if we can focus on what matters, like take the knowledge we have now about what really matters to prospective students and to current students, especially some other stakeholders too, and have a filter through which we evaluate all of our owned channels and communications. I think the quality of communication has visibly improved and progressed. There's no question. There's always opportunity to improve, and I think we can be sharper and more strategic in the way that we use our real estate. You know, so you all have just done a really nice upgrade to the website and the landing page, the homepage. And yet, when you take a look at, I've just done like a quick scan for a couple of universities that might be in our peer set, two that I've seen consistently in our peer set, Georgetown and Wake Forest. And because I've had to do some business recently with some people at Vanderbilt, like I took a look at Vanderbilt. And when you look at the way that you start to engage with their assets right off the bat, they're not talking about features of the university. They're talking a little bit more about purpose and about philosophy and about points of difference. It's like when you go to our website, it basically says located in Williamsburg, Virginia, William & Mary brings together the global opportunities of a public research university with the personal education of a liberal arts and sciences institution. That's a very positive statement, and it does describe us, but is it the best introductory message? Is that the jumping off point for all the rest of our communications? To me, that feels a little bit more features oriented, like here's how to describe us kind of functionally, as opposed to thinking a little bit more about purpose and impact and philosophy. So, you know, I mean, Wake Forest talks about, you know, using our ideas, knowledge, talents, and compassion on behalf of humanity and all of its difference and diversity. Georgetown talks about an education for the mind and heart, intellectual rigor, social justice, self-reflection, knitted together, research, studies, interactions with faculty, and career decisions. And Vanderbilt, you know, talks more about their values, about acquiring knowledge, not debt, immersive academic community, faculty attention you deserve, the heart of Nashville, you belong here, leaning into belonging. And interestingly, two of the three of those also talk about place the way that we do. Like Vanderbilt talks about Nashville, Georgetown talks about DC, because they are in special locations, and we are too. But our positioning research shows us that location is not the difference maker, right? Like it's sort of it's an enhancement. So I just think that we need like a really smart filter and lens through which to be looking at all of our public communications and especially our owned channels to make sure that we are using the knowledge we have now to have the most effective, most persuasive kinds of communication that reflect what our audience cares the most about.
Terrific.
Outstanding. Thank you, Anna Maria. We are 1 minute within the time that we allotted for this discussion. I want to invite any final reflections or thoughts across any of the questions and ideas that we covered during this hour, and then we can bring the meeting to a conclusion.
I'm really sorry that I'm hogging the microphone so much. I really hate when people do this.
No.
I'm doing it. So
You're not hogging. This is all really, really helpful, Anna Maria. So please.
okay. So on this last point, I mean, many of you will be aware that employers are in a world of pain right now. Like it's just there's just there's so much opportunity, but there's so much transformation occurring, and there's also a concern about the work readiness of the next generation and of the youngest people entering the workforce right now. And there's a lot of concern about that. So I also feel that because we're so focused on internships, because we are focused on workforce readiness, I think there's more to be done around workforce readiness. And there are more bridges and programs we can build directly with employers to distinguish ourselves in terms of, how ready our graduates are to make a difference right away as they get started and how they're differentiated. I mentioned this to Laura Regas a couple of weeks ago because she's got student experience. She's the chair of student experience. I feel like as a board, we're not talking enough to the careers part of the university. I just feel like there's also potentially more innovation to be done, and we're all over internships. I mean, internships is amazing. And then beyond internships, or how do we sort of convert our investment in internships into, a bigger relationship with employers, much more awareness and appreciation for the quality of our graduates, and real visible programs that showcase how successful our students are when they enter the workforce. So, but an opportunity, because just taking it back to the first thing I said, which is employers are worried about the next gen, and they're dealing with a lot of transformation, and I just think we can kind of lean into that. Like there are unmet needs that maybe other universities aren't directly addressing as well as we could.
I'm going to take that as an agenda item there. That's really helpful, Anna Maria.
Yeah.
We'll circle back with Brian and with Ginger on it.
Any others before we adjourn?
Just one other thing. One other quick thing. I love how we are building the Washington campus, our Washington presence. I wish, my dream would be that we could do something similar in New York, and I think that would really help William & Mary quite a bit, and it could vastly accelerate national preeminence. And I think that if we have an East Coast axis between New York and Williamsburg that includes Washington, obviously, I think that could be super powerful for us. I saw Don Lohman recently up here. Don is the new chair of the Business School Advisory Board, and I met him for a drink last week, as a matter of fact, up in Greenwich, and we were talking about that. We were talking about the opportunity for William & Mary in New York.
It's a great idea. Awesome. Okay. This has been remarkably productive. So thank everybody for making the time as we all prepare to wind down for the year. But it seems to have been, at least in my estimation, well worth it. So Great conversation. We will continue this dialogue in our next meeting. We'll certainly also continue it between now and the next meeting. So heads up for additional touch points as we try to get ready for our conversation in February. With that, I will adjourn the meeting and wish you all a very, very Merry Christmas and a happy set of holidays.
Thank you, Kendrick. You too.
All
Thank
right.
you. Thank
Thanks,
you, guys.
everyone.
Everybody.
Have a great
Happy
holiday.
Happy holidays.
Thank you.
Take care.
Happy holidays.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.